Good morning and welcome to the first meeting of the Education, Children and Young People Committee in 2026. The first item on our agenda this morning is consideration of subordinate legislation, which is subject to the affirmative procedure. The committee will take evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills and her officials on the Education Scotland Act 2025 Consequential Provisions Regulations 2026 draft and the Official Statistics Scotland Amendment Order 2026 draft. The Cabinet Secretary will then move the motions to approve these instruments. And can I welcome Jenny Goruth, Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills, Jackson Paris, Qualifications Scotland Policy, Education Reform Directorate, Scottish Government, and Judith Brown, Solicitor, Scottish Government Legal Directorate. And Cabinet Secretary, can I invite you to make an opening statement on these draft instruments?
Good morning, Convener, and Happy New Year to you and to committee members. Thank you for inviting me to discuss the Official Statistics Scotland Amendment Order 2026 and the Education Scotland Act 2025 Consequential Provisions Regulations 2026. These two draft instruments are being taken together as they both are in effect required as a consequence of implementing the Education Scotland Act 2025. These, alongside a wider package of secondary legislation, will ensure Qualifications Scotland and the Chief Inspector for Education in Scotland can take on the relevant SQA and HMI functions, duties and responsibilities. The Official Statistics Scotland Amendment Order 2026, if approved, makes changes to the Official Statistics Scotland Order 2008. The 2008 order provides that wholly Scottish devolved statistics produced by the persons listed in the schedule are specified as official statistics for the purposes of the Statistics and Registration Service Act 2007. Listed persons are bound by the Code of Practice for Official Statistics and how they are published. Put simply, this instrument replaces the SQA with Qualifications Scotland as a producer of official statistics in the schedule of the 2008 order. The Education Scotland Act 2025 Consequential Provisions Regulations 2026, if approved, will update the Budget Scotland Act 2025 and provisions in legislation that were inserted by the recent Scottish Languages Act 2025. For the Budget Act updates, the instrument adds in references to Qualifications Scotland and the Office of His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Education in Scotland as regards the education and skills portfolio. The SSI ensures that they can be funded by Scottish ministers during this budget year. For the provisions made in the Scottish Languages Act, the SSI replaces all references to the SQA and HM inspectors of schools with references to Qualifications Scotland and the Chief Inspector. This ensures the recently agreed provisions in the Scottish Languages Act will continue to work as originally intended. I therefore commend this order to committee and I'm happy to answer any questions this morning.
Thank you very much. Willie Rennie.
The Cabinet Secretary will recall during the process of the bill we discussed it changes to quality assurance but also the accreditation function, and there were two separate kind of reviews that were underway in both. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary could give us an update on how those are progressing.
In relation to accreditation, as far as I'm aware, that is being taken forward by Qualifications Scotland. I met with Shirley Rogers very recently towards the end of last year. I'm meeting with her, I think, next week, and with Nick Page, the new Chief Executive. So I'd be more than happy to write to the committee with more detail on that following my meeting with Shirley Rogers and with Nick Page in relation to accreditation, which was an issue that we discussed at length in relation to Stage 2 and Stage 3 amendments with the committee, but also in the Chamber.
And the quality assurance aspects?
Those are also being taken forward, as I understand it. I don't know if Jackson wants to say more in relation to the work officials have been supporting as well.
Yeah, so it's kind of been developed in terms of what that kind of review, the National Quality Assurance Review, will cover. That's been worked on with colleagues at Qualifications Scotland, as the legislation said, is looking to appoint someone to undertake that review, an independent advisor, and that needs to be done within 3 months of the provision coming into force, which is kind of due in the next month or so.
Yeah. Just to make the obvious point, I mean, there was a kind of a compromise reached during the process of the bill where we thought a pragmatic, reasonable way to progress was to allow a review so that everything could be considered in the round, because there was quite a lot of confusion about exactly what was accreditation and where the quality assurance functions played in. But there was a strong view amongst many of us that ultimately we should have everything accredited and in a separate body. And I hope that that is all considered as part of this review. So it's just really to put the marker down to repeat the point from before.
Yes, very much so. And that matter of accreditation was something that we debated and discussed at length with committee, and also the fact that a number of qualifications are not accredited at the current time, not least in terms of national qualifications that are often delivered in schools. So I want to reassure the member that that is being taken forward by Qualifications Scotland. But I will raise those matters again with Shirley Rogers and Nick Page when I meet with them in the coming days. And I also commit to writing to the committee with further detail following that meeting to provide that reassurance on those points, because they were very clearly heard by me at the time, and they were a key component of the bill as was passed in terms of accreditation.
Okay, thank you.
Since we're speaking about the SQA and your ongoing discussions with them, where are you now, months and years on from the 2024 higher history exam results? Is this still something that concerns you? Because the new Chief Executive, Nick Page, did a sit-down interview, I think it was with the Herald, and he accepted he still had concerns about those results. Where are you as the Cabinet Secretary for that cohort of students who, and their teachers and their parents and carers who have concerns about those results?
I think there were concerns raised at the time in relation to higher history, in relation to the 2024 qualification. We're now into 2026, convener. I'm mindful of that. There was, of course, a consideration of that, an investigation carried out by SQA that was then peer reviewed independently by the Welsh Qualifications Authority. So my view at that time was the advice I was provided with was that there was nothing further that could be taken in relation to action, and in terms of the detail of that was fully considered. I was cognisant of the views of the new Chief Executive, notwithstanding that I think were published in the Herald last summer. I've discussed this with Mr Page. We'll continue to provide engagement with SQA to that end, but to my mind there has not been any further evidence put forward. But what I would say, convener, because we discussed this at length, and I think you've led quite a lot of the interest in that politically, which I recognise and actually have a level of respect for in terms of your interest in this. If there are other higher history teachers who have concerns, then I would obviously put on the record that they should get in touch with the Qualifications Scotland directly. I know Qualifications Scotland have undertaken a number of implementation events in relation to marking, setting the national standard, providing support in relation to markers, and that has been undertaken on the back of the review that was carried out. But again, I want to provide that reassurance that there needs to be that constant dialogue with the profession. And to my mind, one of the things that we should learn, the lessons we should learn from qualifications reform, is that we have to listen to the teaching profession better. It was always my experience as a teacher myself and as an SQA marker that there was a bit of a disconnect between the profession and the role of the SQA. That is something that's got to change in relation to Qualifications Scotland. So that work's being undertaken. I recognise the committee's interest on this point. I'll continue to engage with the Chief Executive and the Chair on the substantive issues in relation to having that consistent approach. And I think also providing reassurance to children and young people and to parents and carers as well in relation to the national standards.
You mentioned there that you spoke to Mr Page after his interview. Was that to criticise him for speaking in that way? Was it to ask for more information, or was it to agree with him?
No, I think we had a routine engagement in relation to catch up on a number of different areas, including the points that Mr Rennie's raised this morning in relation to accreditation. So I don't recall it being in those in that kind of forum, convener. It wouldn't be usual for me to seek a meeting on the back of a press interview, for example, with the Chief Executive. We have regular catch-ups, so we had a regular catch-up, to my mind, on these issues, and we discussed them in the round.
Mm-hmm. And I have raised this, and I had one question in the chamber, so we get more opportunity here in committee when you bring these sub-ledge forward. The issue in 2024 was, in my view, very significant. But then we had the scenario where last year, not only did they make slight gains in higher history, they went above where they were the year before. What did you think personally when you saw that? Because when I spoke to Shirley Rogers and the new Chief Executive just after he was appointed, before the results came out, they thought we might get somewhere a halfway house between that very low of 2024 and previous results. Actually, students got above where they'd been before. It was a huge increase. That must have raised concerns with you.
I think it's always very difficult to make generalisations about cohorts, and having taught cohorts of young people, you will see attainment fluctuate year on year, and it will depend on the class, it will depend on the individual pupils themselves and their performance on the day ultimately in relation to their exam results. So it's very difficult to have that read across and to predict what you might expect to see in terms of performance by way of the cohort. It's fair to say, though, in this year's exam results, we saw a dramatic increase and improvement in relation to attainment. That's to be welcomed. But across the board, we saw improvements in relation to attainment. So that's also to be welcomed. So If there were issues in relation to that subject qualification itself, though, that would have been something that SQA would have considered in relation to the pass mark, and I'd be more than happy to come back to the committee on that. But from my memory, and I don't have the detail in front of me today because it's not directly relevant to the SSIs we were discussing today, there was not, I don't think, changes made in relation to the overall pass mark last year, 2020. Sitting, but I will clarify that point with my officials after the committee meeting today. But that, to my mind, would suggest to me there weren't issues. And certainly, of course, in advance of qualifications, the results day, I always meet with the SQA. We spend a lot of time going through the results, looking at individual subjects. We spent a bit of time going through the higher history course qualification result for exactly the reasons you raised today, Convener. And no concerns were raised by SQA at that time in relation to the approaches that were taken for the qualification this year. So we've seen an improvement in attainment. I think that is to be welcomed, but I accept the points you've made today, Convener. All I would say is that no further information from SQA has been shared on that, but if there are further issues from higher history teachers and from markers, I'm always keen to hear from them, and I would encourage them to engage directly with Qualifications Scotland.
Okay. The Scottish Government policy note, page 4, states that Scottish ministers have made the following statement that in respect of UNCRC that these provisions are compatible with UNCRC requirements. Why then is your department and your government still bringing forward legislation that is not compatible with UNCRC?
Forgive me, Convener, which legislation would that be?
Well, the promise bill that Natalie Dawn Innes brought forward. I know you recuse yourself from the promise, but you will be aware of discussions that have been held within Cabinet, and it was, you know, one of the big issues that came out of our consideration of that piece of legislation, proposed legislation from the government, is stakeholder after stakeholder was concerned that the way the bill had been drafted by the Education Department, in similar ways to other departments within the Scottish Government, meant elements of it were not compatible. And I'm just wondering why, when it's so important for you, for these SSIs to say that this SSI is compatible, why then is new legislation your department and your government are bringing forward not compatible? So
you alluded to Cabinet conversations there, Convener, and I have to again put on the record, as you have already done so, that I am recused from the promise because my wife sits on the oversight board of the promise, and in relation to those conversations, I am not privy to those conversations. I do not sit at the Cabinet table for discussions which pertain to the promise. My overall general comment, though, would be in relation to UNCRC, and I will defer to Judith Brown on this, that ministers would have to ensure that all legislation we take forward is compliant with the UNCRC. So it's a general view that I give you in relation to that, because I can't give specifics on the promise bill for the reasons I've set out. But I don't know, Judith, if you want to say any more in terms of UNCRC and our engagement in relation to that piece of legislation.
That's correct, that all legislation requires to be compatible with UNCRC. I'm not sure there's anything more I can say in relation to the promise bill specifically.
Well, I'm not asking about the promise bill. Okay. Indeed, we have the Minister for that coming shortly to our committee. But are you aware, maybe Ms Brown, are solicitors within the Scottish Government aware that almost every witness on that specific bill reiterated concerns they had made about other bills in other departments on the Scottish Government, that legislation is being brought forward that may have to be changed at stage 2 because when it's presented by the government it is not compliant with UNCRC, yet here we are just with quite a simple, straightforward SSI that ministers are telling us in their policy note is compatible with UNCRC?
We are required for all the SSIs to produce an impact assessment in relation to UNCRC and to be satisfied that they are compliant, and so that's what's been done for these two SSIs. But I'm not cited on the promise bill, I'm afraid. And on
well, if we take it away from the promise bill, because I understand that the complexities that poses for the Cabinet Secretary, quite rightly. But this, we were told about the housing bill, I think it was, and other pieces of legislation. So surely solicitors in the Scottish Government and Cabinet Secretaries and Ministers must be hearing the same evidence that we're hearing as this committee and other committees, that legislation is being brought forward that witnesses are telling us is not compatible with UNCRC. So is every witness who have come from different spheres wrong and the government are right? Or are the government taking on board these concerns, and what are they doing with those concerns?
Well, I think the government always listens in relation to concerns that are raised by stakeholders. I think the general point is that ministers are not able to take forward bills that are not compliant with the UNCRC in general terms, would be my observation of that. And I'm sure in relation to the specifics on that bill that the Minister will be listening and engaging with stakeholders specifically. I know she's in front of committee following my evidence session today, and you may want to pursue these matters with her directly, given my recusal from that bill overall.
Is it something officials could come back to us on? Because I think you will have seen from our Stage 1 report that we mention this on this bill. It has been highlighted in other committees. We're coming to a period where there's a lot of legislation coming through Parliament. Yeah. If we as opposition MSPs have to keep amending legislation, surely it would be better if it could be changed before it's even lodged. So perhaps could we get a commitment to look at the legal aspects of these concerns around compatibility with UNCRC? Because I stress the point, it is not just about one bill at this committee. Witnesses said they made similar points earlier on in the process about other bills in other committees, and I just felt I had an opportunity, since it's in your policy note today, to raise it, and I will with the Minister as well. But could officials perhaps come back to us on that?
I think we can take the general point away and be more than happy to. There's a couple of issues that have come up today, Convener, that I'm going to write to committee on. So if we can look that into our response, we're more than happy to give you that reassurance in relation to our approach.
Okay. Willie Rennie.
A different subject, but one of the criticisms of the old SQA was the fact that it was slow. Ken Muir referred to it as sometimes intransigent, not engaging with the teaching community, but slow to update national qualifications. What assurance have you had from the leadership at Qualifications Scotland that they are going to be swifter in developing and updating new qualifications, in particular to make sure they're in alignment with Curriculum for Excellence?
Absolutely. So I would agree with Mr Muir's observations, and in relation to engagement with the profession, I think some of it was pretty challenging, which led into the challenges, of course, that then were experienced during the pandemic. So the backdrop to the challenges in the pandemic don't just happen in a silo. I think we should be mindful of that backdrop that many teachers experienced prior to the pandemic in terms of engagement with the qualifications body. The wider point, I would say, relates to the work that's being led in relation to Education Scotland on the curriculum improvement cycle. So we mustn't divorce that from the overall approach to qualifications down. That's being led by the teaching profession. I attended a really helpful session actually in the summer recess in Glasgow with a number of teachers who've been engaged in leading that work, in leading qualifications reform, and the curriculum improvement cycle is, to Mr Rennie's point, the approach that we will have as a government to ensuring that our qualification system keeps up to date. And we know that in recent years it has not been at the cutting edge in relation to ensuring that our qualifications are updated and we respond to societal changes accordingly. So curriculum improvement cycle is the way in which we're going to have a cycle essentially of updating and changing our qualifications. That was a commitment that I made in the Chamber I think a number of years ago now, and it directly related to a recommendation that we had received from the OECD on exactly the point that Mr Rennie has raised today. So the work has been led by the curriculum improvement cycle that will help to inform the qualifications update that Education Scotland is leading, and I would also put on record the appointment that we have had of a secondary head teacher in the schools unit within Qualifications Scotland. To my mind, that approach is going to help improve engagement with the teaching profession. We have a bespoke approach to engagement with schools now that's being led by a secondary head teacher, and I think that's really important in sending a very clear message to the teaching profession, particularly the secondary teaching profession, that we know that engagement in the past has not been as it should be, and that it will improve in relation to that engagement and how it's being led. And I'm sure the committee may want to engage directly with the schools unit to that end in relation to that engagement and how that's working currently in practice with the profession.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move motion S6M 19851 in her name that the Education, Children and Young People Committee recommends that the Education Scotland Act 2025 Consequential Provisions Regulations 2026 draft be approved?
I move that the committee recommends that the Official Statistics Scotland Amendment Order 2026 and the Education Scotland Act 2025 Consequential Provisions Regulations 2026 be approved.
I think we're only doing one at a time, is that correct? So if you're okay just to say moved, Cabinet Secretary, that will keep me on the right side of the clerks. Thank you very much. Is there anything you wish to add?
No.
No, and no other member wishes to come in. Then we move to the question. The question is that motion S6M 19851 in the name of Jenny Gilruth be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The committee has approved the order. The committee must now produce its report on this draft instrument. Is the committee content to delegate responsibility to me as convener to agree this report on behalf of the committee? Yes. That is agreed. Now can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move the motion S6M 19852 in her name that the Education, Children and Young People Committee recommends that the Official Statistics Scotland Amendment Order 2026 draft be approved.
Moved.
And anything to add, Cabinet Secretary?
No, Convener.
No other member wishes to come in at this point. Therefore, the question is that motion S6M 19852 in the name of Jenny Gilruth be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed, and the committee has approved the order. The committee must now produce its report on this draft instrument. Is the committee content to delegate responsibility to me as convener to agree this report on behalf of the committee? Yes. That's agreed. That concludes the consideration of these instruments. Cabinet Secretary, can I thank you and your officials for your attendance this morning? And before we move on to our next item, I'll briefly suspend the meeting to allow for a change of witnesses. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. The next item on our agenda this morning is consideration of subordinate legislation, which is subject to the affirmative procedure, and that is the Cross-Border Placement of Children Requirements, Effect and Enforcement Scotland Regulations 2026 draft. The committee will now take evidence from the Minister for Children, Young People and the Promise and her officials on the instrument, and the Minister will also move the motion to approve the instrument. Can I welcome Natalie Dawn as Minister for Children, Young People and the Promise, Louisa Brown, Kinship Care and Fostering Team Leader, Rachel Wilson, Team Leader, Children's Residential Care Unit, Scottish Government, and Claire Montgomery, Solicitor, Scottish Government Legal Directorate. Minister, can I ask you to speak to the draft instrument in your name? Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everyone. I guess I'll start by saying Happy New Year to everyone. I hope you had a nice break. Convener, I'm very pleased to bring forward these draft regulations which ensure legal recognition of orders and arrangements for children who are on temporary cross-border placements into residential care homes and foster care in Scotland. I want to put on record that these regulations are not intended to be a substitute for suitable placements of children being available in their home nations. I'm also clear that cross-border placements should only occur in exceptional circumstances where it is in the best interests of a child. Our intention is to ensure that when these placements are necessary, that they are appropriately considered and assessed and subject to a clear regulatory framework. We've heard that for many placements into residential care homes in Scotland, local services often know very little about the placed child or their circumstances. Indeed, they sometimes only found out about a placement during a crisis. New notification requirements and regulations aim to ensure that this does not happen in the future. We've also heard that children are sometimes placed in settings or services that are not fully equipped to meet their needs. The regulations aim to address these concerns by requiring requiring placing authorities to assess the suitability in advance. There are additional conditions to be met for cross-border placements into residential care homes, including regular visits and placement reviews. This aims to address concerns we've heard that those involved in the child's care in Scotland are frequently not included as part of existing review processes and that visits might be infrequent. For those children placed into residential care homes who are subject to deprivation of liberty orders, the order must be reviewed at least every 3 months to ensure necessity and proportionality. For cross-border fostering placements, the draft regulations again require placement suitability to be considered in advance and notification of placement to be made to those with an interest in the child's care. They aim to build on existing practice by requiring that a fostering agreement is in place before the placement starts, covering issues like arrangements for visits and reviews. Whilst most cross-border placements into Scotland are temporary arrangements, there are some very limited circumstances in which it could be appropriate for a child to be brought into the Scottish system. For example, if a child's family relocates to Scotland, the relevant Scottish local authority may agree to take over their care. These types of permanent transfer have been possible since 2013, and the regulations preserve this whilst bringing all the rules on cross-border placements into one place. And I am happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Willie Rennie.
Thanks for the Minister for that update. Could you just tell us what are the numbers of cross-border placements just now from England? Has it gone up and down? And what are the reasons for that?
I probably need to pass over to officials for the numbers. I know that currently, I believe there are 4 deprivation of liberty order placements into. In fact, I'll pass over to officials for the official number.
I'll just read out our latest data. So we've got, as at the 30th of November 2025, there was approximately 100 children placed cross-border into residential care in Scotland. A breakdown by the legal basis for the placement is there 63 on full care orders, 8 on interim care orders, 26 on voluntary arrangements, and 3 deprivation of liberty order placements. I can pass to Louisa potentially for fostering.
I think we have less data, but there's approximately 30 from other nations, England and Northern Ireland. We don't have data from Wales currently.
And is that up or down with all those numbers?
So for deprivation of liberty orders, because we've got the 2022 deprivation of liberty order regulations, we know that prior to them coming into force, I think there was approximately 17 deprivation of liberty orders in 2022, and now they're down to 3. So they've reduced significantly. For the other types of orders, we've only been recently doing evidence gathering around these, so we couldn't say for sure around the trends of those.
So why has it gone from 17 to 3 then? Do we know why?
Well, I know that they are undertaking work in England just now in relation to ensuring the capacity of their own sector. So, for example, I met with the Minister yesterday to discuss cross-border placements, among other things. He was telling me about a number of different initiatives that they're carrying out in England. One of them, for example, is the regional care partnerships, or, sorry, I might need to come back to the committee with the official term for that, which is a sort of new initiative to try to, as I say, really ensure capacity in England. So much like, you know, Mr Rennie will remember when I've been in committee talking about, for example, placements into secure care, we have seen those reducing over time. So, as I say, I think that that's as a result of a lot of the work that's going on cross-border.
So when you're discussing with the Minister, the UK Minister, one of the previous concerns was that two children, one from Scotland and one from England, in the same care home would have different rights. And we were anxious about that, and I know there's been other measures to try and limit the impact of that. Was there any indication from the UK Minister that they would be changing the rights for children in England to be similar to those in Scotland? Was there any discussion around about that to make sure we don't have that disparity?
There was no discussion on that, Mr Rennie. As I say, there was a number of things that were on the agenda for my discussion with the Minister yesterday. Cross-border placements was one of them, so we didn't get into that level of detail. But there are a number of things that we're following up with each other on, so I'd be more than happy to put that to Ministers at the UK Government if Mr Rennie would wish.
And has there been any, therefore, again, just returning to the issue about the two different standards for different children in potentially the same environment, has there been any problems that have emerged from those different rights for the children? Has there been any evidence at all that there have been issues that were highlighted in the committee previously?
Could you be more specific, Mr Rennie?
So, has there been any complaints, any, from their advocates, about the fact that the children who've come from England don't get the same rights as those from Scotland? Has there been any issues around about that we're aware of?
Not that have been brought to my attention, but I'm not sure if officials could elaborate any further. No.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, that's fine for now.
Just come back to Ms Brown. Do we not have figures for Wales because there are no transfers from Wales, or is it because we can't? That's not shared?
We've asked and they haven't been able to give us any figures, and we actually assume that there aren't any at the moment.
But they're not saying there are zero, they're saying they can't provide it.
Yes.
And you're making that assumption?
Yes, there's only 3 from Northern Ireland and the rest are from England, so the majority are from England, and we're not aware of any, and we have asked, but they haven't provided any.
And have we had any issues getting figures before?
And this is the first time we've collected the data, so we don't have any historical data to compare.
But no other, it's not an issue with Welsh Government not sharing or anything like that? This
no.
just seems to be...
Yeah.
Okay. Paul O'Kane.
Thank you very much, Convener. Obviously, I wasn't a member of the committee when evidence was taken on the bill, but my understanding, just from reading some of the exchanges and some of the evidence that was given, is that part of the rationale for reducing cross-border placements was to, and this was, I think, from Scottish Government and Children's Commissioner, was to try and force the English system to become better by reducing the amount of placements that came to Scotland, therefore compelling the previous UK Government to do better. Now, from the exchange with Mr Rennie there, the numbers have obviously decreased, and from what you've said, Minister, you appear to be having a positive and fruitful dialogue with the new UK Government about what they're doing to improve the system. So if that is the case, and the numbers have gone down, and there is now an improvement, if you like, in the system in England, which is very welcome, of course, does the rationale still stand in terms of trying to reduce cross-border placements?
Well, I think I've been very clear several times before, Mr O'Kane, that I appreciate you weren't in the committee at that time. I think there will always likely be a need for cross-border placements, but that is only when it is in the best interests of the child. So, there will always be exceptional circumstances where it may be better for a child to be placed in Scotland. However, I think, when I was at committee before discussing this, and in relation to some of the numbers, especially, for example, going into secure care, it was very clear that there were failings in the system in England, and that, children... there may have been other reasons over what was best for the child. So I think it's always important to try to reduce those cross-border placements when it's not in the best interests of the child, but understanding that there always may be a need for them.
But would you recognise, because I agree, when it's in the best interest of a child, that the placement has to be the appropriate placement. But obviously what this legislation does is create a number of processes in order to get through that. If it is in the best interest of the child and there is an urgency to it, do you recognise there is a risk to children and young people who are living in England or Northern Ireland if they can't quickly access the placement that's required in Scotland?
Well, there have been that has been taken into account, understanding that there will always be the need for example, emergency placements. So when you're looking at, for example, the regulations around visits, the requirement for visits to take place, there's a recognition that sometimes there may not be time for that visit to take place in advance of that placement needing to be put in place, essentially. But then that would obviously have to take place at a later date. There's a time limit around that. So there's an an enabling factor there to ensure that when there are this need, or when this need arises for those sort of emergency, short-term, quick decisions, essentially, that has been taken into account.
And what if I can just finally, Convener, just ask what further consultation or discussion you've had with those in the secure care sector around the concerns that they raised about limiting cross-border placements and the impact that that would have on the services that they run in Scotland?
Well, it's not something that I have personally discussed recently, but I know there's obviously, Mr O'Kane will be aware of the level of work underway around the secure care. So officials have conversations around this on a regular basis. As I've been clear before, my priority has to be on safeguarding children and young people, and whether they're in secure care, whether they're in residential placements. So while I do understand the concerns of the secure care centres in relation to the funding and the cross-border placements, I have to go with what's best for children and young people. But at the other side of that, there's the work that's ongoing around reimagining secure care, around what we're doing to future-proof it for the future. So I think we need to take those two things at the same time in terms of, where those concerns may be arising around the cross-borders. We're looking to support in other ways.
Thank you, Convener.
John Mason.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener. Following on from previous questions, there was one or two points kind of came out to me from the policy note, and Willie Rennie was asking how it was different from a child from Scotland or from England, how they were looked after or treated. And it particularly struck me is the second page of the policy note. The Scottish Government also understands that children are sometimes placed without education provision having been agreed, leading to children being without education for prolonged periods. That is very concerning, that sounds to me. So is that the kind of issue, so that a Scottish child, that would not happen because the local authority knows they need education, but it could happen for a child from elsewhere? Is that the issue?
That's exactly the issue. I was made aware of a child that was placed in Scotland without suitable education provision being arranged in advance. The local authority was not informed of that placement and only became aware when they were approached for an education place, which at that time was not possible. The safeguards that are being placed through these regulations would ensure that that was not the case, because there would be time for adequate planning, because, as Mr Mason points out, it is unacceptable for children to be without education for a length of time, and unacceptable for children to be treated differently. So I believe that's one of the positive aspects of these regulations.
So that means that in future, every child, wherever they're from, will be entitled to exactly the same education provision going forward? So,
they would have been entitled anyway. The thing is that the placing authority wouldn't have known about it, so there wasn't that ability to plan in advance and to consider the child's needs. So I think that's where it comes into play.
Okay, so they're more likely to, or they should be getting that provision. Okay. You and others have already mentioned the question of it's the child's best interest to be placed in Scotland. Can you expand on that as to what that actually means? Because if a child is from, say, Devon, I could understand they might want to be in Cornwall to be a bit away from their local environment. But to be in Scotland, even in Glasgow or Edinburgh, is quite remote.
Yeah, I can't comment on, individual cases, but there could be examples of, children may have family in Scotland, children may have friends in Scotland, they may need to be away from a certain area or certain people. So there are, and I couldn't account for all the different sort of reasons why a child might be
But is one of the reasons just that they can't find a place in England, so they dump them in Scotland?
You would have to refer to, I couldn't speak for English counterparts, that wouldn't be for me to say that. Okay. I would hope not, from everything that I've discussed with the committee before.
No, I accept the situation's improving, so that's positive. These visits that take place, either pre-placement, and you did explain already that it may not be possible for a pre-placement visit, if I said that correctly. Who are they carried out by? Are they always carried out by the placing authority, or could they, could Devon ask Falkirk, say, could you do a visit for us?
Yeah, and I'll ask Louisa to expand. It would be the placing authority's responsibility, but obviously with the planning in advance and the discussions that will be taking place in advance, they can work out, there will be conversations around what would be best suited for that individual child's circumstances. But Louisa, I don't know if you could
The Minister's correct. It's the policing authority's responsibility, but they do in practice, even in Scotland, if policing outside of your own authority, they can delegate that to another agency or to another local authority to do that for them. But the responsibility lies with the policing authority.
Yes, because it talks about placements might be in a remote part of Scotland, but if you're in the Isle of Wight or somewhere, then Glasgow's remote, isn't it? So, yeah. I mean, it could be anywhere in Scotland is remote from that point of view. And, I mean, the 6 weekly visits, I mean, that seems like a kind of minimum to me. And it says where a 6 weekly visit is not possible, and elsewhere it says insofar as reasonably practicable. I mean, that does seem quite a lot of a get-out. And 6 weeks is quite a long period if a child is in an unknown family, unknown town. How are they getting on? I mean, can you give us any reassurance? Do you would there be phone calls made as well? Because if a 6 weekly visit's not practicable, that child could be in a bad situation for quite a while.
So the 6 week that time strain is in place because there may be legitimate reasons that it might not be possible to adhere to the 6 weekly visits. So this is not to allow, authorities to say, oh, we just didn't have time to do that. It could be down to, for example, a social worker being off that week, a social worker being ill, something that has came to fruition that is preventing that visit. However, the regulations require that if that visit cannot go ahead, it is to be arranged as soon as possible after that 6 week mark.
Okay, thanks, Camilla.
In response to Mr Mason, you mentioned that you'd become aware of a case of a child that didn't have access to education. So how long was that individual denied education? And did you become aware because it had to be escalated to you for ministerial involvement, or was it just an update that this is what's happening?
That was an update. In terms of the time frame for that child going without education, sorry, I would have to pass to my officials for...
That was something that had come up during our stakeholder engagement, and we were doing some consultation around the development of the regulations, and we'd heard about that as a case study, but I would have to check, but I don't think it was something that was formally raised to us. I think that would just kind of come up in conversations with stakeholders.
And do you recall, was it days, weeks, months?
I don't recall the exact time. I can double check, but in my mind I think it was around about at least a week or longer, but I can come back and clarify.
And presumably if that was highlighted as a case study, you can't guarantee that this hasn't happened more than once. And do you have any historical data on hearing about this case going back for further examples, and do you know how widespread or not that is?
No, we just have anecdotal evidence. And when we found out about this case, we'd heard from other local authorities that that kind of situation wasn't uncommon, where a child would be placed into Scotland and education hadn't been arranged for that child, but more often than not, the local authority would find a education place for the child last minute. But in that particular case, the school the child was expected to be placed in had no places left, so we were unable to get education. But it could be happening more regular than we were aware of.
Okay, Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to carry on the line of questioning John Mason has undertaken, because we know that young people are expressing concern that they're unable to access health services and often education services. We also know children who are receiving treatment in Scotland at our cancer centres. Often their education is disrupted, and we don't see that continuity. That hasn't been completely resolved. So I'm interested in terms of this notification and what your expectation will be from two very distinct organisations, be it the NHS or a local education authority, to fund and provide, as it says in the regulations, around securing that provision. Because I think a notification is one thing, a duty, for example, a chief executive's letter to fund that is something very different, and it wouldn't necessarily close the gap completely between expectation and then actually delivery of these services.
The regulations set out the people who must receive any notification required and the information which is to be contained within that notification. So that includes, a number of key partners, health, education, residential or fostering contacts, the chief social work officer, Care Inspectorate, there's a number. And as I say, when that takes... Because this hasn't happened before, when that takes place, I would expect, a conversation or conversations to be happening around what will be required for that child, what will be needed for that child. It's entirely the purpose of bringing this forward so that we understand the needs of children who are placed in Scotland and how we can best support them. So while I appreciate, Mr Briggs, that there's no duty there, the fact that all these partners are involved in the child's care or the child's support services, I think should bring confidence in terms of how that child will be supported going forward.
I think the Minister will understand my concern as an Edinburgh MSP. Some children are waiting 2 years to access mental health services, some of the longest waits. If there was a placement made here in Edinburgh, is the Minister suggesting there's a prioritisation to these young people placed within a health board? Or is it just joining the end of that queue and that's seen as then mental health services being delivered? I'm not quite sure a notification does much more than just simply says this young person who's been placed here has been in mental health services in a different part of the United Kingdom. And then what expectation ministers are actually putting forward with this?
Well, I think that would have to actually be considered before the the child was going to be placed was agreed, because we would have to consider if those services were available for that child, if there was going to be a barrier to that child accessing certain services, then that placement probably wouldn't be in the best interests of that child. So I would take that back to before the notification in terms of considering where that child should be placed.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Camilla.
Thank you, Minister. I raised this with the Cabinet Secretary on her SSIs, but your policy note very clearly states that this SSI is compatible with UNCRC, but you will remember the significant discussions we had on the bill you brought forward about compatibility with UNCRC with the Promise Bill. Yeah. Where are you as a Minister and the Government on legislation that's coming forward, not just the Promise Bill, but we heard other examples from witnesses about compatibility with UNCRC?
Sorry, Convener, is that strictly in relation to the Promise Bill, or are we talking over and above?
You can tell us about the Promise Bill, because I'll certainly be raising it when we have our Stage 1 debate very soon. But it did come up from witnesses who told us, as the committee scrutinising this legislation, that they had made similar points on the housing bill to other committees, etc. And I'm just still wondering why the government have to tell us that a relatively straightforward SSI is compatible with UNCRC, yet there are concerns about the compatibility of new legislation being brought forward, such as the Promise and other bills coming forward from the government.
Well, Mr Ross will remember there are two aspects of the Promise Bill, for short, that are not compatible with UNCRC around the fostering register and another aspect. Obviously, I'm happy to get into more detail around this, as I did in the previous committee session at the Stage 1 debate. Mr Ross is aware of the Children's Rights Scheme, which I laid before Parliament last month, in terms of progressing engagement with the UK Government to explore the removal of legislative restrictions that limit our ability to enhance human rights. And equally, by November 2026, the Scottish Government considers that progress in finding a more straightforward and effective route to extending protection for children's rights has not been sufficient. In terms of that engagement with the UK Government, will commission a review of the provision of UK acts in devolved areas to identify, where we need to act. So while I appreciate that there has been legislation brought forward, and I gave the reasons around the two aspects in the Promise Bill, there is work underway, wider work underway across government to ensure that going forward our legislation and our legislation is compliant.
I mean, with respect, that's almost exactly the same answer you gave at committee, but I also think you gave an assurance that you would go away and seek further advice. Effectively, are you saying nothing's changing at the moment? The government will continue to bring forward legislation. You're speaking about things in months and years' time, but we have more than a dozen pieces of legislation to get through before the end of this Parliament in a matter of months. stakeholders are telling us that we need to see amendments to your legislation at stage 2 and potentially other bills coming from the Scottish Government. Is there any change in the thinking, either from solicitors, legal directorate, ministers, cabinet secretaries, about bringing forward legislation in this way that continually is criticised by stakeholders to the committees scrutinising these pieces of legislation that they're not compatible with UNCRC? Is that changing the thinking at all amongst ministers?
So I couldn't speak for other ministers. I can't speak for other pieces of legislation other than the piece of legislation that I've brought forward. As I've said, it's regrettable that 2 aspects of that don't fall into UNCRC compliancy, and I've given the reasons for that around complexity, around times. However, as Mr Ross states, I am seeking further advice in relation to the concerns and the conversations that I've had around the Promise Bill in its entirety. So I'm, as I say, more than happy to provide an update around or provide more information around that at the stage 1 debate next week. But I don't know if you would be happy just to follow up on Mr Ross's points around UNCRC more generally.
Yes, of course. So I know this has been an issue of real concern to the committee, and as the Minister set out, it's something that's been given close consideration by the Scottish Government. I think what I would stress is that provisions of bills that are brought forward by the Scottish Government are compatible with the UNCRC. It's simply that the compatibility duty in the UNCRC Incorporation Scotland Act doesn't attach to certain functions, so those that are in UK enactments, and the Minister set out the government position in the draft proposal for the Children's Rights Scheme, which was published in November. So exploration is underway as to whether there is a simple way to resolve the issue from the UNCRC Supreme Court case, which would prevent us having to go and reenact great swathes of the statute book within Scottish legislation. I think the concerns around that, around kind of coherence and accessibility of the statute book, have been raised before, but we appreciate the concerns that the committee and stakeholders have around this, and it is something that we're giving serious consideration to. But you'll appreciate, Convener, I cannot confirm or deny or divulge any legal advice.
No, and I'm not asking that. I suppose for me, there's, and I think, and I'm not putting the words into the mouths of our witnesses, but there is a frustration that if this only happened once, say the housing bill, that was the one that was used as an example, but it is happening time after time, and it just feels like there are warm words, but there's never any action to resolve the issues. We as a committee mentioned this in our Stage 1 report, and we have asked questions about it because people outside this building are effectively criticising the government for bringing forward legislation in this way. And I'm still not reassured, and I hope I can be next week, but I'm still not reassured that in our final few months of this Parliament we're going to get a resolution to this when it is something the government have known about for quite some time and have had, i.e. a warning with previous legislation, yet continue to do it with this bill. Is that something you would accept and understand, Minister?
I understand your concerns, and I understand the concerns. As I say, I've had, and I'm again referring to my engagement most recently around the Promise Bill, I have had these concerns brought to me as well. I have tried to provide as much reassurance as possible in terms of the many provisions included in the Promise Bill, and the overarching need for the Promise Bill and the aims of it in terms of protecting children and young people. But I do understand your concerns in relation to both this and the wider the wider feeling across government in relation to legislation being brought forward. I've given you the government's response to that. We are leading work on that. We are committed to realising the full aspects of UNCRC. And as I say, I'll update further in relation to the specific points that the committee raised in the report around UNCRC in relation to the Promise Bill.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I now invite the Minister to move motion S6M 19990 in her name, that the Education, Children and Young People Committee recommends that the cross-border placement of children requirements, effect and enforcement Scotland Regulations 2026 draft be approved.
I move that the committee recommends that the draft cross-border placement of children requirements, effects and enforcement Scotland Regulations 2026 be approved.
Thank you. Anything to add, Minister?
Nothing further to add. Thank
No,
you, Convener.
and no other colleagues wish to come in. Therefore, the question is that motion S6M 19990 in the name of Natalie Dawn Innes is agreed. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
That is agreed, and the committee has approved the order. The committee must now produce its report on this draft instrument. Is the committee content to delegate responsibility to me as convener to agree this report on behalf of the committee?
Yes.
That's agreed, and that concludes the consideration of this instrument. And can I thank the Minister and her officials for their time this morning. And the committee will now move into private session to consider our final agenda items, and I suspend this meeting. Thank you.